A lonely millionaire, overwhelmed by the silence of his grand estate, stared at the empty cradle in his nursery, wondering why his life had turned out this way. His heart longed for the joy of children, yet fate had refused to bless him. Then, one rainy evening, two hungry children knocked at his door, their faces so familiar, they could have been his own. But how was that possible? If you believe that life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it, like share and subscribe. This story might just resonate with something deep inside you. Don't forget to leave a comment. Let's talk about what really matters. On a cold, windswept evening in Belmont Heights, Andrew Somerset sat alone in his vast office within the Redwood estate. The glow from the fireplace flickered softly against the walls, but the warmth it offered felt distant. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the windows, as if echoing the solitude he had grown accustomed to. A millionaire by every measure, Andrew had it all, except the one thing he had always wanted, a family. He leaned back in his leather chair, his gaze drifting over the sprawling estate outside. The house was immaculate, a symbol of success and wealth. Yet, to Andrew, it felt more like a prison. The dreams he had nurtured of becoming a father, of raising children who would run through these hallways, had long since faded. The space that had once been filled with ambition and hope now seemed suffocating. As the minutes ticked by in the quiet of the night, his thoughts wandered to the life he had built and the life that had slipped away. The sound of the wind outside seemed to echo his loneliness. And just when the weight of his thoughts seemed unbearable, the sharp ring of the doorbell sliced through the silence. Andrew blinked, momentarily disoriented by the unexpected interruption. He stood up slowly, pushing the thought of his empty life aside, and walked toward the door. It was late. Who could it be? He opened the door, and before him stood two boys. They were thin, their clothes tattered, faces drawn with hunger and exhaustion, their eyes, strikingly familiar, locked onto his. They were children, no older than 10 or 11, with eyes as green as his own. The resemblance was uncanny. "We're sorry to bother you, sir," the older boy said, his voice trembling, "but we're hungry. Please, can you help us?" Andrew stared at them for a long moment, the words caught in his throat. Something about these children felt different. There was a pull, an inexplicable connection he couldn't place. His heart clenched as he took in their desperate expressions. He stepped aside, allowing them to enter. "Come in," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "I'll have something for you to eat." He called for Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper, and for Mrs. Morales to prepare a meal. As he spoke, his thoughts continued to race. Who were these children? How did they end up here, alone, in the middle of the night? As the boys settled into the sitting room, the younger one, Ethan, spoke again, this time in a hesitant voice. "Do you know a woman named Rachel Morgan?" Andrew froze, his hand gripping the doorframe tightly. Rachel Morgan. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a name he hadn't thought of in years. Rachel had been his assistant, the woman he had once loved before he married his wife, the woman who had slipped away from his life, the woman whose memory still lingered in the deepest corners of his mind. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. A dozen questions flooded his mind. Was this some sort of twisted coincidence, or was there something more to this encounter than he could understand? He turned back toward the boys, trying to hide the panic rising within him. Why do you ask about her?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Ethan seemed to hesitate before replying, glancing at his brother. "She's our mom," he said softly. "She told us to find you." Andrew's heart skipped a beat. He looked at the two boys again, the pieces of a puzzle starting to fit together in his mind, but he wasn't ready to face them yet. This was too much, too sudden. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling louder as if to match the turmoil building inside him. Cliffhanger Andrew stood there, paralyzed. The name Rachel Morgan echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. What did this all mean? Could it be true? Were these boys really hers? Andrew paced around his office, unable to shake off the memory of the strange encounter with Owen and Ethan. His mind was a whirlpool of questions that refused to settle. How could those boys possibly be linked to him? The resemblance was undeniable. Yet how could he reconcile their existence with the life he had lived, with the choices he had made? The mansion was silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. The emptiness of the house pressed down on him like a heavy weight. His eyes wandered across the room, falling on the vacant chair where his wife used to sit. She had long since moved out, her absence a permanent scar on the walls of this place. Andrew had never been one to show weakness, but in this house, with its cold marble floors and high, lonely ceilings, he couldn't help but feel the enormity of his solitude. His longing for a family, a chance to be a father, had faded with time, replaced by the emptiness of success that offered him nothing in return. But tonight, everything had changed. He sat down heavily at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, but none of them mattered. His mind kept drifting back to Owen and Ethan. Why did their faces haunt him? Why did their words resonate so deeply, especially when they had spoken about Rachel, the woman who had been his assistant, the woman he had once dreamed of marrying, but who had vanished from his life after he had married someone else? She had been the one that got away, the one he had loved in silence, the one he had never been able to forget. He stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer, and went to the window. The night outside was stormy, the wind whipping the trees around like wild dancers. The storm seemed to mirror the chaos brewing inside his mind. What if Owen and Ethan were somehow connected to Rachel? What if the childlessness he had mourned for years was part of something bigger, something he had been blind to? He walked back to his desk and opened the drawer where he kept old files, flipping through the papers absent-mindedly. His fingers brushed against an old envelope, one he hadn't seen in years. It was from Rachel, her handwriting unmistakable, the letters a memory he could almost hear in his mind. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated 7 years ago, just before he had married. Rachel had written about a secret she had kept from him, a secret that would change everything if he had known. She was pregnant with his child. He read the words over and over, unable to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. His pulse quickened as he understood the implications. She had kept the child, but somehow, the truth had never reached him. He had never known. The letter went on to describe how Gregory Sinclair, his trusted legal advisor and close friend, had stepped in to prevent any contact. It was clear now that Gregory had played a role in keeping him away from the truth. Andrew's heart sank as he pieced together the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal. It wasn't just Rachel who had been silent. It had been Gregory, too. His mind raced, his thoughts racing ahead of him, trying to make sense of it all. Why had Gregory done this? What else had he been hiding? The weight of the discovery was suffocating. For years, he had trusted Gregory, relied on him as a friend and confidant. Yet here, in front of him, was the evidence of his betrayal. The reality of what he had missed, what had been stolen from him, felt like a physical blow. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His past had just come rushing back to him with the force of a hurricane. Hook, despite his efforts to remain detached, Andrew could not stop the thoughts that swirled in his mind. The boys, their faces, the connection to Rachel, it was all too much to ignore, even though he tried to push it away. The idea of a life he never knew he had was now consuming him. As the hours passed, Andrew found himself staring at his phone, the screen glowing in the dim light of the room. It felt like an eternity before a message popped up on his screen. The name attached to it was one he hadn't seen in years, Gregory Sinclair. The message was simple, yet heavy with meaning. "You need to meet with me, Andrew. There's something important I need to tell you." His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, a deep sense of unease settling in his chest. He couldn't help but wonder, was this the same man who had helped hide the truth from him all those years ago? Why was he reaching out now? After everything. Did he know about the letter? Did he know that Andrew was starting to piece together the truth? Andrew hesitated, his mind conflicted. Could he trust Gregory, or was this just another lie in a long chain of them? Cliffhanger. The message sat there on his phone, its implications weighing on him like a stone in his stomach. He stared at it for a long time, the uncertainty gnawing at him. There was no turning back now. The pieces were all falling into place, and Andrew knew he had to confront Gregory, whether he was ready or not. Andrew's mind was still swirling from the events of the night before, the memory of the boys, the echo of their words. Rachel Morgan kept replaying in his head. He couldn't understand why his past, one he thought he had buried, was now resurfacing with such force. His instincts told him to ignore it, to let it fade, but his heart was pulling him in a different direction. The boys, Owen and Ethan, had some connection to Rachel. That much was clear. But why were they here, at his doorstep? In the dead of night, he decided to reach out to someone he trusted, Gregory Sinclair. Gregory had been his lawyer, his confidant for years. They had gone through thick and thin together, from business deals to personal matters. But Andrew hadn't seen him in months. Their relationship had been strained since Andrew's wife left, and he knew it had been too long since they'd spoken. Gregory was a man of business, a man who thrived in the world of high-powered law firms. But Andrew had always respected him. Gregory had been the one to guide him through rough patches, the one person he felt he could trust in this cutthroat world. As Andrew stepped into the quiet Manhattan cafe, the familiar chime of the doorbell echoed, marking his arrival. The place was nearly empty, the late hour keeping most patrons at bay. At the back of the room, sitting alone, was Gregory. He looked just as Andrew remembered, impeccably dressed, his posture straight, his face betraying no emotion. But there was something different this time. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, seemed distant, almost weary. Andrew approached the table, his footsteps slow, measured. Gregory, he greeted, extending his hand. Gregory stood, shaking his hand firmly but without warmth. The handshake felt distant, too formal for a friendship that once thrived on mutual respect and camaraderie. They sat down across from one another, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. "So," Gregory began, breaking the silence with his usual controlled tone, "what's so urgent? You seemed rather unsettled last night." Andrew studied him carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. But Gregory's face was a mask. "It's about those boys, Owen and Ethan." Andrew hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened. "They came to my house last night." Gregory raised an eyebrow, though his expression remained unreadable. "Oh, and why would they do that?" Andrew felt the weight of the question settle in his chest. "They say they know Rachel." The mention of Rachel's name was like a spark in the room. And for the first time, Andrew saw something flicker in Gregory's eyes, surprise, confusion, or maybe even fear. It was fleeting, but it was there. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, his gaze never leaving Andrew's face. "Rachel," Gregory echoed, his voice a little too calm. "That's strange." Andrew nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Gregory. "They said Rachel's their mother. She told them to find me." Gregory's fingers drummed lightly on the table, a subtle sign of agitation. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced out the window, as if searching for something beyond the glass. "This is all very unusual," he said finally, his voice cold but measured. Andrew leaned forward, a sinking feeling growing in his stomach. Something wasn't right. Gregory was hiding something. The hesitation, the careful words. He knew too much about Rachel. He knew more than he was letting on. "Do you know something about this? About Rachel? About what's happening?" Gregory didn't answer immediately, his gaze flicking briefly to Andrew before looking away again. "You're asking the wrong questions, Andrew." His voice was low, almost dismissive, as though he had already made up his mind on the matter. "Am I?" Andrew replied, his voice tightening with the frustration that had been building up all night. "What the hell do you mean by that? These kids show up, claiming to be Rachel's sons, and you're telling me it's just Nothing. Gregory's face softened into something that was almost pitying. No, it's not nothing. It's just complicated. Too complicated for someone like you to understand. Andrew's pulse quickened. What do you mean by that? Gregory sighed, running a hand through his hair as if he were deciding how much to reveal. I mean that you're too far removed from this world. Andrew, you live in a world of your own, one that doesn't involve the people you've left behind. Rachel, she wasn't just an employee to you, but you chose to leave that part of your life behind. And now, these boys, they're a result of that. Andrew could feel his temper rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. I don't understand. Are you saying that I'm responsible for them being here? For Gregory cut him off? I'm saying that you need to be careful with what you ask. Andrew, this isn't about you or me anymore. This is about things that were buried a long time ago. Andrew stared at him, trying to make sense of his words, but Gregory was already standing up, signaling the end of the conversation. You need to go back to your life. Forget about the boys. Forget about Rachel. Just let it go. But Andrew couldn't. He wasn't ready to walk away. Not now. I can't let it go. Gregory, not after everything I've learned. Not after seeing those boys. I need to know the truth. Gregory's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. You'll regret it, Andrew. Some truths are better left buried. Cliffhanger. As Gregory turned and walked away, he glanced back, his voice barely a whisper. It's too late now. Andrew sat there, stunned, the weight of Gregory's words hanging in the air. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to face the truth, no matter what it meant. Andrew couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had followed him ever since his meeting with Gregory. His mind raced, replaying every word, every glance. There was something off about Gregory's reaction, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The lawyer had always been composed, always in control, but yesterday there had been hesitation. For the first time, Gregory had seemed vulnerable. That vulnerability triggered something inside Andrew, something deep, something old. It felt like a door had been cracked open. And now, all Andrew could think about was what lay beyond. Sitting at his desk in the sterile, perfectly organized office of Somerset Enterprises, Andrew couldn't focus on the piles of paperwork before him. His thoughts kept drifting back to the two boys, Owen and Ethan, standing on his doorstep. They were his children. His mind screamed it, but his heart refused to believe it. How could they be his children? He had never been told about them. He had never been given the chance to be their father. His eyes landed on a stack of old files on the far side of his desk. One of the folders was a faded, worn brown, a relic from his past. With a sigh, Andrew pushed aside the new files and reached for the older one. As he opened it, the papers inside seemed to gather dust, each one feeling like an unwanted ghost from a time he had tried to forget. As he flipped through the documents, one paper in particular caught his eye. It was a letter, its edges curled with age. The handwriting was familiar, unmistakable. It was Rachel's. Andrew's heart skipped a beat. Rachel. He hadn't thought about her in years. He'd buried the memory of her and moved on, married to someone else. But now, sitting alone in his office, with the weight of the past pressing down on him, the memories flooded back. He unfolded the letter carefully, as if it were a fragile thing that might shatter at the slightest touch. The letter was dated 7 years ago, shortly before his wedding. In it, Rachel spoke of something she had kept from him for all these years. She had been pregnant with his child, the child that now stood on his doorstep. She had never told him, had never given him the chance to be involved. Rachel had kept her secret, and in doing so, she had hidden a piece of his life, a life he never knew he had. Rachel's words echoed in his mind as he read Andrew. I couldn't tell you. I was scared. But now, I think you deserve to know. Our son, your son, has been growing up without you, and I've kept him away from you for too long. I can't hide it anymore. Ethan and Owen are your boys. The letter explained how Rachel had raised the children on her own, how she had struggled, and how she had tried to protect them from the man who had been responsible for their existence. She had kept them away, thinking it was the right thing to do. But now, all of that was unraveling. Andrew's hands trembled as he read. It was too much. The truth was too much to process. And then came the worst part, the part he hadn't expected. Gregory Sinclair, the man he had trusted for years, the man he considered a friend, had known about this all along. Gregory had played a key role in keeping the truth from Andrew. He had actively worked to prevent Andrew from knowing about the existence of his children. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly fell into place, Andrew could feel a cold sense of betrayal creeping in. His mind reeled. But there was no time for denial. The truth was right in front of him, and it was undeniable. Gregory had been a part of this. He had helped conceal the truth about Owen and Ethan, and now, Andrew had to face the fact that his entire life, his perception of his past, had been based on lies. Twist the more Andrew read, the more he realized that Gregory had been the one to manipulate the situation. He had been the one to block Andrew's path, to prevent him from ever finding out about his son. Andrew had trusted Gregory, and now that trust was shattered. The feeling of betrayal was like a weight pressing down on his chest. But there was no time to wallow in it. He had to act. Andrew closed the letter and placed it back into the file, his mind working furiously. He couldn't just let this go. He had to confront Gregory. He had to know why Gregory had done this, why he had kept this from him for so long. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many secrets left in the dark. Hook internal. Andrew stood up from his desk, his hands shaking slightly. I shouldn't get involved in this, he thought. I should just walk away. But I can't. I've already gone too far. His internal struggle raged. He knew what he had to do, but the fear of facing the truth paralyzed him. He had to know. He had to confront Gregory. Andrew felt a rush of adrenaline as he picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over the keys. He knew what he had to do. There was no more running from the truth, no more denying the existence of the life he had missed. He had to confront the man who had taken so much from him. He dialed Gregory's number. The line rang, and for a moment, Andrew hesitated. But then Gregory picked up. His voice, calm as ever, came through the speaker. Andrew, I was expecting your call. Cliffhanger. Andrew took a deep breath, his voice steady but his heart racing. We need to talk. Now. The morning after his unsettling meeting with Gregory, Andrew couldn't focus on anything. He sat at his desk, papers scattered around him, but his mind was far from the work in front of him. The names Owen and Ethan still echoed in his head, their faces imprinted in his thoughts like a permanent stain. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he thought he knew was about to change forever. He had told himself that he would handle this carefully, that he wouldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. But as the hours passed, Andrew found it increasingly difficult to ignore the pull of curiosity, the need to understand what had happened, to find out why two strangers were knocking at his door with such a life-altering revelation. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. He had to face the boys again. The park near Redwood Estate was quiet when they met, a peaceful sanctuary far removed from the chaos swirling in Andrew's mind. The benches were damp from the morning mist, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering soft secrets to each other. Owen and Ethan were already sitting on one of the benches, looking smaller than Andrew had remembered, as though the weight of the world was resting on their shoulders. Andrew approached them slowly, taking in the sight of their faces, their eyes still tired, their clothes still frayed. Despite their rough appearance, there was something about them that made Andrew feel a connection. They weren't just two children who had been dealt a bad hand by life, they were his children, and that realization hit him harder than he expected. He sat down next to them, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't want to overwhelm them, but the words he had rehearsed in his mind earlier now seemed inadequate. He wasn't sure what to say, or how to begin. "How are you both doing?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Owen, the older of the two, glanced at Ethan before speaking, his voice small but clear. "We're fine," he said. but there was a deep sadness in his eyes that Andrew couldn't ignore. Ethan, sitting quietly beside his brother, looked up at Andrew. "We've been better," he added, his voice barely a whisper. There was something in his tone that made Andrew's chest tighten, a heaviness that he couldn't escape. The conversation seemed to hang in the air between them, uncomfortable, as though they were all trying to navigate a path that was too narrow to walk comfortably. Andrew shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of their words settle on him. He wanted to do something, anything to make this right, but he knew he couldn't just fix things with money or apologies. It wasn't that simple. After a moment of silence, Ethan spoke again, his words laced with the rawness of years of hardship. "Our mom, she's really sick. We don't have the money for her treatment," he said, his gaze dropping to the ground. "We've been trying to help, but it's not enough." The words hit Andrew like a physical blow. He had no idea. All this time, he had been living his own life, his own pain, unaware of the suffering of these children. They had been struggling, surviving on their own, with no one to turn to for help. Andrew's throat tightened. The sense of guilt was overwhelming. He had been so focused on his own losses that he had never considered the reality of what these boys had been through. The pain in Ethan's voice was the kind that didn't just fade with time. It was a wound that ran deep, a wound that no one could fix with a kind word or a check. "How long has she been sick?" Andrew asked quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "About a year," Owen replied, his voice steady but carrying a weight that belied his calm exterior. "She's been getting worse. We try to get by, but it's not enough." The silence between them was heavy now, the unspoken emotions weighing on Andrew's chest. He felt a deep, gnawing ache in his heart, one that told him that he was seeing the consequences of his own past actions. These children, his children, had been living in pain, and he had never known. But in that moment, as he looked at their faces, Andrew realized something he hadn't before. This wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about what he had missed. It was about what he could do now. These boys had suffered, yes, but they weren't broken. They were strong, and they had survived. And that strength, that resilience, was something Andrew respected more than anything else. Twist Owen hadn't once blamed Andrew for anything. There was no resentment in his voice, no bitterness. He spoke like someone who had accepted the hard truths of life and moved forward, unwilling to dwell on the past. Andrew felt his chest tighten as the realization settled in. These boys weren't asking for his pity. They weren't asking for anything from him at all. They were simply asking to be seen, to be understood. And for the first time in a long while, Andrew felt like he was seeing them, really seeing them. Hook emotional. Andrew realized that he no longer saw them as children in need of rescue. He saw them as individuals, as strong, brave souls who had fought for everything they had. He no longer felt sorry for them. He admired them. He took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts, but before he could say anything more, Ethan looked up at him with a steady gaze that held more than his years should have allowed. Cliffhanger. In that moment, Andrew's heart skipped a beat. Ethan's eyes held a truth that Andrew had not been prepared for. He could see the question in Ethan's eyes, the silent plea for something more than words, and Andrew knew, with a certainty that almost frightened him, that the truth of who these boys were had only just begun to unfold. The days following Andrew's first encounter with Owen and Ethan had been a whirlwind of emotions. His heart and mind were at war. On one hand, there was the life he had built, the one that gave him wealth, success, and status. But on the other hand, there were the boys, two children who had been thrust into his life with a truth that he couldn't ignore. Despite all the walls he had built around himself, Andrew had initially seen them as reminders of his lost chances, a living testament to his regrets. They were the children of a woman he had once loved, but who had disappeared from his life, leaving only the faintest trace. But over the past few days, something had shifted. He no longer saw Owen and Ethan as mere symbols of his own failure. He began to see them for who they really were, resilient, resourceful, and full of heart. They were not children to be pitied, but children who had fought for everything they had, children who deserved a chance. So when he was invited to join them in their efforts to organize a charity event for the local community, Andrew didn't hesitate. It was a simple gesture, but to him, it felt monumental. It was the first step in breaking down the walls that had kept him distant from others for so long. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself. The charity event was being held at a community center not far from Redwood Estate. It was a modest place, far removed from the luxuries Andrew was accustomed to. But as he entered the small building, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of belonging. The room was filled with families, children, and volunteers, all working together to create something meaningful. The warmth in the air wasn't from the heating system, it was from the shared effort, the collective hope of a community coming together. Owen and Ethan were there, of course, organizing everything with a quiet authority that belied their young ages. Andrew was impressed by how they had taken charge, how they had managed to turn their hardship into something positive. He was even more impressed when they didn't hesitate to include him in every aspect of the planning. They treated him like a partner, not a charity case. They trusted him. As the evening wore on, the three of them worked side by side, arranging tables, setting up decorations, and preparing for the guests. Andrew found himself laughing, a genuine laugh that he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. It was a sound he had almost forgotten, and it felt good to hear it again, later, when the event was finally underway. Andrew stood at the back of the room, watching the people who had come to support the community. He glanced over at Owen and Ethan, who were busy helping families get settled in, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Their faces were lit up with pride. For the first time in a long time, Andrew felt a deep sense of purpose. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about status. It was about helping, about being part of something that mattered. And in that moment, he realized something. He wasn't just helping them. They were helping him too. They were showing him what it meant to truly live, to engage with others, to be present in their lives, to contribute. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, and it was starting to change him in ways he hadn't expected. Climax, small. They worked together to put up the final decorations, the three of them standing side by side, sharing a quiet smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, Andrew felt like he belonged. It wasn't just about the work they were doing, it was about the connection between them. It was about being a part of something bigger than himself, something real. Hook light. As the evening wore on, one of Andrew's colleagues from the firm, who had arrived at the event to show support, came over to him with a curious look. "You're here with these kids a lot." "Huh?" she asked, her tone light but probing. "I've noticed you've been spending quite a bit of time with them. Is there something going on?" The question was casual, but it hit Andrew like a wave. He wasn't used to having his personal life scrutinized, and the comment made him realize how visible his connection to Owen and Ethan had become. What had once been a quiet gesture of charity was now starting to become a topic of conversation among those around him. He wasn't sure how to respond, but he didn't want to lie either. Cliffhanger. Before he could answer, another voice joined the conversation. One of the volunteers, a longtime acquaintance of Andrew's, leaned in and said with a grin, "You know, there's something between you and those kids, isn't there? You look, well, like you've finally found a place to belong." The words hung in the air, and Andrew's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized how much he had changed, how much he had let these boys into his life. It was a realization that both excited and terrified him. Could he really make a place for himself in their world? Could he embrace this change, this new path that had suddenly opened up before him? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Owen and Ethan, who were standing across the room, smiling and laughing with the other children. They were happy, and for the first time in a long time, so was Andrew. He took a deep breath, letting the feeling wash over him. This was just the beginning. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he was ready to face it. The days following Andrew's decision to involve himself more deeply with Owen and Ethan felt like a whirlwind. What had started as a quiet act of kindness, a simple desire to help, had quickly turned into something far more complicated. As he became more immersed in their world, the walls he had carefully constructed around his life began to crack. At work, the whispers started. His colleagues, initially silent, were now exchanging glances and murmurs whenever Andrew passed by. He had always prided himself on keeping his personal life separate from his professional one, but this was different. The connections he was making, the way he was spending his time, none of it seemed to fit with the persona he had carefully cultivated over the years. In a place where image was everything, his growing bond with Owen and Ethan raised questions. Andrew had always kept his charity work low profile, but now it was impossible to avoid. His family, too, was confused by his actions. His wife, Sarah, seemed to watch him with a mixture of disbelief and concern, as if she couldn't quite understand the shift in his behavior. They had talked briefly about it the night before, but the conversation had ended in silence, both of them retreating to their separate corners of their large, empty house. For Andrew, the connection with Owen and Ethan was something beyond charity, beyond obligation. It was something real, something that he had been missing for so long. But for Sarah, it was a threat, a challenge to everything they had built together. He could feel the tension in their home, the unspoken words hanging in the air like thick smoke. The questions from his colleagues only amplified it. He had once been the man who had everything: wealth, status, and control. Now, he was beginning to realize that none of that mattered in the face of something as raw and honest as what he had found in these boys. But could he reconcile the man he had been with, the man he was becoming? One evening, as the world outside his window turned a deep orange with the setting sun, Andrew found himself sitting in a small, dimly lit cafe in downtown. He had agreed to meet Owen and Ethan there, after school, to discuss the upcoming charity event they were planning. Andrew had thought he was simply going to meet them for a quick catch-up, but as soon as he arrived, it was clear that something was different. Owen and Ethan were already seated at a corner table, their faces solemn, the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. Ethan was playing with a small piece of paper on the table, crumpling it and smoothing it out repeatedly, while Owen sat back, his arms crossed, watching Andrew with an intensity that was new. As Andrew sat down, Owen spoke first, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "We need to talk, Mr. Somerset," he said, his tone heavy. Andrew looked at the two boys, suddenly aware that this conversation wasn't going to be like the others. He nodded, waiting for one of them to speak, his own heart beating faster than usual. Ethan spoke next, his voice quiet but clear. "We appreciate what you've done for us. You've helped us in ways you don't even know. But this is bigger than us." Andrew leaned in, confused. "What do you mean?" Owen's eyes flicked to Ethan before settling back on Andrew. "We know about your life, Mr. Somerset," he said. "We know what you've done, how you've lived, but we also know that this isn't easy for you, and it's not just about charity. It's not just about helping us anymore. It's about something bigger." Andrew furrowed his brow. "I don't understand." Ethan gave him a long, thoughtful look before replying. "We've been living in a world where we had no choice but to survive. We had to grow up fast, because no one else was going to help us. And now, you're in our world. But you're not just helping us, you're becoming part of it, and that's not something you can walk away from." The weight of Ethan's words settled heavily in the air between them. Andrew felt a tightness in his chest as he realized just how deeply these boys had been shaped by their circumstances, how much they had suffered, how much they had sacrificed. "I didn't expect it to be easy," Andrew said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I never thought it would be like this. It's hard, trying to fit into a world that's so different from my own." Owen, who had been silent for a moment, finally spoke again. "You don't need to fit in, Mr. Somerset. You just need to understand. You need to understand what it's like to be where we are, to see what we've seen. You can't just play the part of the Good Samaritan and walk away. This is real, and we need you to see that." Andrew's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, He understood what Owen was trying to say. This wasn't a game. This wasn't something he could just step into when it was convenient for him. These boys weren't projects to fix. They were lives to understand. And in that moment, he realized that he couldn't just walk away from them. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Cliffhanger. As the conversation drew to a close, Owen suddenly looked at Andrew with a new intensity. "Come with us," he said simply. "Come into our world. See it for what it really is. You've been helping us, but you haven't seen the whole picture yet." Andrew hesitated, a part of him wanting to say no, to retreat back into the safety of his old life, to return to the world he knew. But another part of him, the part that had started to care, the part that had begun to understand, knew that he couldn't. He took a deep breath. "What do you mean?" Owen stood up, and with a look that Andrew couldn't quite place, he spoke again, his words filled with something deeper than just an invitation. "We're going to take you to the real world, the one we live in, and you can't turn back after that." Andrew felt a knot form in his stomach as he stood to follow them. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he knew one thing for sure. His life, the life he had built, was about to change forever. The grand ballroom of the Rivera Hotel in downtown Manhattan was nothing short of extravagant. The polished marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with towering floral arrangements that added a soft, yet undeniable fragrance to the air. This was a world of wealth and power, a world that Andrew Somerset had come to understand all too well over the years. It was the world he had chosen. And yet, as he stood in the entrance of the ballroom, he felt a coldness settle in his chest. The event was one of the company's prestigious annual fundraisers, a gathering of influential figures in business, politics, and high society. Andrew had always attended, and his presence was often expected. His name was synonymous with success, and his reputation had grown stronger with each passing year. But this time, things were different. He had invited Owen and Ethan to accompany him, a decision that felt both natural and unsettling. It was a small gesture, a desire to share his world with them, to bring them into his circle of influence. But as they stepped into the room, it was immediately clear that they didn't belong here. The boys were out of place in their simple, yet clean clothes. Their eyes darted around, taking in the lavish surroundings, but there was a hesitance in their every movement. They didn't fit in this world of wealth and privilege. Andrew had hoped they wouldn't notice the stares, the judgment in the eyes of the other guests, but they did. It was impossible to ignore the whispered conversations, the raised eyebrows, and the unmistakable glances that lingered a little too long. Owen shifted uneasily on his feet, his posture stiff, while Ethan nervously tugged at the collar of his shirt. For a brief moment, Andrew felt a pang of guilt. He had dragged them into this world, a world where they were judged by their appearance, by the simple fact that they weren't like the people in this room. It was a world of rules, of subtle expectations, of belonging to a class that was defined by things other than just money status, connections, and history. As they moved deeper into the ballroom, the uncomfortable atmosphere intensified. Andrew noticed how Ethan's shoulders slumped, how his eyes avoided the faces of those around them. He could see the unease in Owen's clenched jaw. Both boys were trying so hard to hold themselves together, but the strain was visible in the way they shifted under the weight of scrutiny. Andrew knew this feeling all too well. He had grown up on the outskirts of this world, never quite fitting in, always on the periphery. He had worked hard to be accepted, to carve out a space for himself in a society that had often treated him as an outsider. But now, as he watched Owen and Ethan, he realized that they had been thrust into this world without preparation, without the armor that he had built for himself over the years, and it hurt to see them suffer under the weight of it. Just as the discomfort reached its peak, one of Andrew's colleagues, Mark Johnson, approached with a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Mark was one of those people who loved to make others feel small, to remind them of their place in the world. He had always been a little too eager to point out the differences between people like Andrew and people like Owen and Ethan. Mark looked at the boys with a raised eyebrow, his gaze lingering too long. "Did you bring these kids here to your company event?" "Andrew," he asked, his voice dripping with a mixture of amusement and condescension. "I didn't realize this was a charity function." The comment was casual, but it was a slap in the face, one that Andrew didn't expect to sting as much as it did. It wasn't just the way Mark had spoken. It was the fact that he was so comfortable with his words, so sure that his superiority was an unspoken truth in this world. And Owen and Ethan could hear it, could feel the weight of it in the air. Andrew could see the boys' faces drop, their discomfort turning into something heavier, something more painful. Without thinking, Andrew stood up straight, his hand instinctively reaching out to place a protective arm around Owen's shoulder. "These kids," he said, his voice firm, "are as much a part of this world as anyone in this room. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The room fell silent, and for a moment, even Mark seemed taken aback. But Andrew didn't care. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. He wasn't going to allow anyone to belittle the boys just because of where they came from or what they looked like. They were here, and they were worthy of respect, just like everyone else. Cliffhanger. As the tension in the air lingered, the moment was broken by a small voice from behind them. A young girl, no more than 7 or 8, tugged at Andrew's sleeve. She was holding a piece of paper and a crayon, and when she looked up at him, she smiled shyly. "Can I draw you?" she asked, her voice sweet but hesitant. Andrew's heart melted. He nodded slowly, kneeling down to her level. As she began to sketch, Andrew noticed that the drawing wasn't just of him, it included Owen and Ethan standing next to him, their arms around each other. The image was simple, but it spoke volumes. It was a picture of connection, of belonging, of a family that didn't fit the usual mold, but still had a place in this world. For a brief moment, the pressure of the evening lifted. Andrew could feel the weight of the room shift, just a little. The girl's drawing seemed to bring a sense of warmth to the cold, polished ballroom. And for the first time that night, Andrew felt a flicker of hope. But then, as he watched the drawing take shape, a thought crept into his mind, a troubling thought that he hadn't wanted to face. Hook. The more he looked at the drawing, the more he realized that this small act, this simple gesture from a little girl, was something that Owen and Ethan had been missing. They hadn't just been looking for acceptance in a world that didn't understand them. They had been looking for a place where they could belong, a place where they could be seen for who they were, not for where they came from. And then it hit him. Cliffhanger. He stood up slowly, the realization dawning on him like a weight he couldn't shake off. Could he really be a part of this world, the world he had always fought to be a part of, when the world itself was still so divided by things that were beyond his control, as the music from the ballroom continued to swirl around them? Andrew couldn't help but wonder, did he belong in this world after all? Or had he been lying to himself all along? Andrew's hand trembled slightly as he sifted through the cluttered file cabinet, the faint hum of the office's fluorescent lights, the only sound filling the room. It had been a long, tiring day, and his mind had been preoccupied with work, the constant pressure of maintaining the estate, and the unsettling events of the past few weeks. He had been distracted, grappling with the growing bond he shared with Owen and Ethan, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of their relationship. Yet, in the midst of all the noise in his mind, it was something utterly unexpected that captured his attention. A faded envelope, tucked at the back of the drawer, caught his eye. It was yellowed with age, the edges frayed, as though it had been left untouched for years. There was no stamp, no return address, just his name, written in familiar handwriting. His heart skipped a beat as he reached for it, the paper crinkling softly as his fingers brushed against it. It was from Rachel. He opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the letter with a mixture of curiosity and dread. As he began to read, his pulse quickened, the words on the page sinking in with a heaviness he couldn't explain. Rachel's words were clear, but the weight they carried felt suffocating. She had written about the time they shared together, the moments that had seemed so fleeting, and the secrets she had kept from him. The most devastating revelation, however, was this: she had been pregnant 7 years ago and had given birth to 2 children, Owen and Ethan. Andrew felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. He read the lines again, making sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. Rachel had carried his children, and for reasons unknown to him at the time, she had kept them hidden from him. He had never even known. The realization hit him like a hammer, his breath catching in his throat. How could this have happened? How could he have missed this for so long? But it wasn't just the shock of the revelation that left him reeling. It was the realization that someone he trusted, someone who had been by his side for years, was the one who had kept him in the dark. It was Gregory Sinclair, his friend and legal advisor, who had known about Rachel's pregnancy and the children. Gregory, the man he had confided in, the man who had been his closest ally in all matters of business and personal affairs. The thought that Gregory had known and never told him was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything else. He sat back in his chair, staring at the letter, his mind racing. The world around him seemed to blur, and for a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. He thought about the last few weeks, the way everything had been building up his connection to Owen and Ethan, the strange pull he felt toward them, the growing sense that they were somehow tied to his past. Now, it was all beginning to make sense, but the truth was more painful than he had ever imagined. The letter itself was brief, almost like a confession. Rachel spoke of how she had struggled to raise the boys alone, never revealing their father's identity to anyone. She had kept the secret out of fear. She said fear of what Andrew might think, fear of how he would react. She wrote of her longing for him to be a part of their lives, but knowing that, given his life, he would never be able to accept it. As he set the letter down, Andrew's mind raced with questions. Why hadn't Rachel ever told him? Why had she kept this from him for so long? But the questions were quickly overshadowed by the crushing realization that Gregory had been involved in this deception all along. Andrew's relationship with Gregory had always been one of mutual respect, built on years of shared experiences and trust. They had weathered countless storms together, and Andrew had always considered him a reliable and loyal friend. But now, it seemed that the man he had trusted with his deepest secrets had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Gregory had not only hidden the truth about Owen and Ethan, but had actively prevented Andrew from discovering the existence of his own children. Twist. The thought made Andrew's blood run cold. Gregory's betrayal ran deeper than he had initially thought. He had manipulated every situation, covered up the truth, and gone to great lengths to make sure Andrew remained in the dark. The revelation was almost too much to bear. Not only had he been kept from his children, but the man he had relied on for so long had orchestrated it all, using his influence and power to keep the secret buried. In his frustration and anger, Andrew couldn't help but think of how much time he had lost. 7 years. 7 years he could have spent with Owen and Ethan. 7 years of being kept away from his own flesh and blood. All because Gregory had thought he knew better, had thought that protecting Andrew from the truth was somehow the right thing to do. As his mind churned with anger and confusion, Andrew's eyes fell on another object in the drawer. It was an old, dusty recorder, a small device that had been left there years ago, forgotten in the chaos of papers and files. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, with a sense of foreboding, he reached for it. As he turned the recorder over in his hand, a thought struck him. What if this was part of the reason Gregory had kept the truth from him? What if there were recordings, conversations, evidence that could shed light on the full extent of the betrayal? He pressed the play button, and for a moment, there was only static. Then, a voice emerged from the device, clear and unmistakable. It was Dr. Monroe, a name that Andrew hadn't thought about in years. "Andrew," the voice said, filled with urgency, "you need to know the truth. Gregory has been covering this up for years. He's done everything in his power to keep you from finding out. You have the right to know what he's done. You have to hear this." The recording was short, but devastating. It confirmed everything Andrew had feared. Gregory had deliberately hidden the truth from him. Not only had he kept the existence of Owen and Ethan from Andrew, but he had also gone as far as to manipulate Andrew's decisions and influence his life in ways that were not only deceitful, but dangerous. Cliffhanger. The recording cut off abruptly, leaving Andrew with more questions than answers. His hands shook as he replayed the message in his mind. He was no longer just dealing with a lie, he was facing a conspiracy. Gregory's actions were deliberate, calculated, and designed to manipulate Andrew into staying ignorant of the truth for as long as possible. What else had Gregory done that Andrew didn't know about? Andrew stood up from his desk, his mind reeling. The anger that had been building in him now felt like a fire, consuming everything in its path. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let Gregory get away with what he had done, not when it involved his children. He had to confront him. The weight of the truth had been suffocating, but Andrew couldn't allow himself to ignore it anymore. After weeks of wrestling with his emotions and the consequences of Gregory's betrayal, he found himself at a turning point. The revelation about Owen and Ethan, and the deceit surrounding their existence, had set something in motion within him, a deep, internal need to fix what had been broken. It wasn't about love, not at this point. It was about accountability, about making right the wrongs he had unknowingly let fester for so long. For the first time, Andrew realized he was making decisions not out of selfish desires or to soothe his own guilt, but because he had to. It was about restoring balance to a life that had been turned upside down. In the following days, Andrew threw himself into community initiatives, particularly the ones Owen and Ethan had long been involved in. He attended charity events, visited local shelters, and started funding educational programs for disadvantaged youth. At first, it felt mechanical, like he was going through the motions to ease his conscience, but gradually, it started to feel real. Helping others wasn't just a means to an end anymore. It became an effort rooted in something larger than himself. He began spending more time with Owen and Ethan, accompanying them to events and school meetings, sitting through community gatherings, helping them with projects that had always felt too big for the boys alone. Their work was challenging, often exhausting, but for Andrew, there was something cathartic in seeing the genuine smiles of people who were genuinely being helped. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet or business plans that would return big profits. These were people with stories and struggles and needs that were raw and real. And for once, Andrew felt he was making a difference, not for recognition, but because he had to. It wasn't easy, though. The people around him, particularly his family and longtime colleagues, couldn't understand his shift in focus. They didn't get why he was investing so much time in two boys who came from nothing, why he was so adamant about this community work when there were more profitable, higher-profile opportunities to pursue. His business partners were blunt about it. "You're wasting time on this. You've got a whole empire to run. Focus on that." Andrew had always been a man of reason, of calculated decisions. But now, every time someone questioned his choices, he found himself standing firm. He wasn't doing this for anyone's approval. He wasn't even doing it for himself. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. And as he looked at Owen and Ethan, seeing the pain and determination in their eyes, he couldn't walk away. One afternoon, as Andrew was leaving one of the charity events, he got a call from Ethan. The boy's voice, once filled with uncertainty and hesitance, had gained strength in the past few weeks. "Mr. Somerset, my mom wants to see you," Ethan said, his words steady. "She's been asking about you." Andrew felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't visited their mother yet, despite knowing how much she had suffered. He had promised himself that he would, but somehow, the weight of her story had always felt like something too heavy to bear. But now, as Ethan spoke, the need to face his past, was undeniable. It was time. "I'll come," he said quietly. The next afternoon, Andrew made his way to the modest home on the outskirts of the city where Owen and Ethan had grown up. The neighborhood was starkly different from the luxury of Redwood Estate, a reminder of the chasm between his world and theirs. He walked through the narrow streets, the tension of what he was about to do mounting with each step. This was no longer about saving face or offering charity. This was about confronting the people he had failed, about owning up to the reality that he could never undo the years that had been lost. When he arrived, Mrs. Rivers greeted him with a warm but wary smile. She didn't make any move to hug him, and Andrew didn't expect her to. She invited him in without saying much, leading him into a small living room where she and the boys had spent countless nights, battling through illness, poverty, and despair. The room was modest, but the walls were adorned with pictures, Photos of Ethan and Owen growing up, school achievements, family moments. It felt like a place full of memories, both beautiful and painful. "Please, sit," she said, her voice softer than Andrew remembered. "I'm glad you could come." Andrew settled into the chair she gestured to, unsure of what to say. The air between them felt thick, not with anger, but with the silent understanding of what had never been said. Mrs. Rivers didn't waste time with pleasantries. She looked at him with steady eyes, her gaze unflinching, as though she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "You've been good to my boys," she said slowly, "but there's something you need to understand." Andrew nodded, waiting for her to continue. "Before you think that you're doing something special for us," she said, her tone sharp, yet laced with a quiet sadness. "I want you to know that it's not about you. My boys don't need your charity. They never did. What they needed was a father. And you. You were never there." Andrew's chest tightened at her words, but he didn't speak. He could feel the truth of her words, like a weight pressing down on him. "There's something else you need to know." "Mrs. Rivers continued, her voice quieter now. "Owen and Ethan, they didn't ask for any of this. They didn't ask for your pity, and they didn't ask for you to come to their rescue. What they wanted was to know who their father was, to know that there was someone out there who cared." Andrew's breath hitched. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words falling from his lips like a confession. She regarded him silently for a moment before answering, her eyes still unwavering. "That's the problem, Mr. Somerset. You never knew. And now, when everything is too late, you come here offering help. But the truth is, you didn't owe them help. You owed them the truth." A silence fell between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Andrew felt exposed, as though every layer of his carefully constructed life had been peeled away, but just as quickly. The silence was broken by Ethan, who entered the room quietly, holding something in his hand. It was a drawing, a simple sketch of Andrew, Owen, and Ethan. It wasn't polished or professional, but there was something raw and real about it. It depicted the three of them standing side by side, holding hands, together. There was no grandeur to it, no embellishment, just the three of them, a family, in its purest form. Andrew looked at the drawing, his throat tightening. It was a gesture so simple, yet it spoke volumes. They weren't asking for anything grand. They were asking for truth. They were asking for a connection. Andrew stood up slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, looking from Mrs. Rivers to Ethan. "I can't change what's happened, but I promise you, I'll make things right. I'll make it up to you." Cliffhanger. As Andrew turned to leave, Mrs. Rivers spoke one last time, her voice tinged with a sorrowful finality. "He didn't come to apologize," she said softly. "He came to give us just enough to make us believe he cared, but nothing will ever be enough. Will it?" Andrew paused at the door, her words hanging in the air like a question he wasn't sure he could answer. Andrew's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind still racing over the events of the past few weeks. The revelation of his father's involvement in the pain and suffering of Owen and Ethan had shaken him to his core. But the deeper he delved into the truth, the more complicated the emotions became. The rage he had expected to feel toward Gregory Sinclair, the man who had been his closest confidant, was strangely absent. Instead, he felt something far more unsettling. Pity. Understanding. Gregory had been a part of Andrew's life for years, a man who had provided counsel and friendship, who had seen him through every triumph and every failure. And yet now, sitting in front of Andrew, the man seemed diminished, vulnerable, and broken. He had never expected to face Gregory in this way. The man, who had once been a pillar of strength, now seemed more like a man trapped in a web of deceit, caught in the same powerful forces that had governed Andrew's life for so long. Andrew had called him to meet, the tension palpable between them, and for once, The space that had been filled with comfortable silences in their past encounters now felt suffocating. They sat across from each other at a small cafe in the heart of the city, the muted hum of conversation and clinking dishes the only sounds between them. The weight of the conversation ahead was like a mountain, towering over them both. Gregory broke the silence first. "Andrew, I've been avoiding this moment for a long time, but there's no escaping the truth now." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the facade of calm he had worked so hard to maintain over the years. Andrew's heart raced. The words he had feared hearing were now on the edge of his friend's lips, and yet he was somehow bracing himself for more than what he already knew. The truth was still raw, still painful, but it had already begun to settle in his bones. "I didn't want to hurt you," Gregory continued, his gaze dropping to the table between them. "But your father, he's the one who set all of this in motion. Owen and Ethan, they're his grandsons, and I was the one who helped bury that truth." Andrew's eyes widened. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, but somehow he couldn't summon the anger he thought would surge through him. His mind raced back to everything he had learned, the lies, the betrayals, the secrets. He had always wondered why his father had been distant, why he had never spoken of the past. But now, the pieces were coming together, and the full scope of his father's actions hit him like a freight train. "What do you mean? You helped him hide this?" For all these years, Andrew's voice cracked slightly, though he didn't try to stop it. His feelings were too tangled, too raw to be ignored. Gregory nodded slowly, his eyes full of regret. "I didn't have a choice. Andrew, your father, he had his reasons. I couldn't go against him. I was bound by loyalty, by fear. I kept quiet because I thought it was the only way to protect you from a truth that would have destroyed everything you built. But now, I see what it's cost. I see what it's cost those boys. And I can't keep pretending it's all okay." Andrew sat back in his chair, his thoughts a blur. The man he had once seen as a mentor, a figure of stability, was now reduced to someone trying to justify his actions. There was a part of Andrew that wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but another part of him, one he hadn't expected, felt sympathy for Gregory. Gregory had been trapped, just as Andrew had. His hands, though stained with the same secrets, were just as bound by the forces that had shaped Andrew's own life. Andrew couldn't help but wonder, was he just as guilty for turning a blind eye to all of this for so long? Had he ignored the signs in his own life, just as Gregory had? "Do you think I can forgive you?" Andrew's voice was steady now, but the question came with an edge. He wasn't sure what he was asking, whether it was a question about Gregory or about himself, but he needed an answer. Gregory didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the table, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up, meeting Andrew's gaze. "I don't know if you can forgive me," Gregory admitted softly. "I don't think I would forgive myself, either. But you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to understand what your father did and what I did." Andrew felt the weight of Gregory's words sink in. He had always believed that forgiveness was something that came with time, that it was a choice, something that could be offered when the heart was ready. But now, standing on the precipice of understanding, he wasn't sure if he was ready to offer that forgiveness. Not yet. Not until he could make sense of the damage, the pain, and the years of silence that had been kept between them all. As Andrew processed the gravity of what Gregory had confessed, his mind flashed to his own father, the man who had always been so distant, so secretive, the man whose power had shaped Andrew's life in ways he had never questioned until now. What kind of man had he been? What kind of father? But amidst all the questions, one thing became clear. Gregory was just a piece of the puzzle. The real challenge, the real conflict, lay with Andrew's father. He was the one who had orchestrated everything, the one who had kept the truth buried for so long. And now, Andrew had to decide how to confront him. "I can't forgive you, Gregory," Andrew said quietly, his voice firm with a new resolve. "But I can't keep pretending I don't know the truth either." The words felt like a heavy sigh of relief. though there was still a long road ahead. The truth had been uncovered, but it had also left a gaping wound that could only be healed through action, through confronting the man who had caused it all. As Andrew rose from the table, the weight of the moment seemed to settle into his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would no longer allow himself to be complicit in the lies. He would confront his father, face the man who had shaped his world, and demand the answers that had been long overdue. Cliffhanger. Just as Andrew reached the door, he heard Gregory's voice one last time, soft, but filled with desperation. "Andrew, please, there's more. Your father. He's not the only one with blood on his hands." Andrew froze, his heart pounding in his chest. There was more. What could possibly be worse than this? He turned around slowly, the weight of Gregory's final words sinking in. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, orange glow over the old streets of the city. The air was crisp, the kind that signaled the approach of fall, but there was something else in the air that made it feel like a new season was beginning. Andrew stood at the entrance of the community center, his hands in his pockets, watching as Owen and Ethan worked with a group of volunteers. They were busy preparing for the opening of their first art exhibition, a project that had started as a mere idea, but had grown into something much more powerful. It wasn't just an art show. It was a statement, a way to give back to the community that had, in many ways, forgotten about them. The walls of the community center were filled with vibrant paintings and photographs, images of people, of moments, of lives that had once been overlooked but were now being celebrated. The work they had done was beyond just art. It was their way of telling the world they mattered. They had a voice, and it was being heard. Andrew had watched as the two boys had poured their hearts into the project. He had seen them struggle, yes, but he had also seen the quiet pride in their eyes as they arranged the pieces on the walls. For the first time since he had met them, Andrew didn't feel like an outsider, didn't feel like he was walking through life just trying to put the pieces together. He felt like he belonged, not because of the accolades or the recognition they might receive, but because of the change they were creating, change that wasn't measured by how many people attended the exhibition or how much money they raised. It was measured by the way the community came together to celebrate what they had accomplished. The transformation that had begun in Andrew when he first started helping Owen and Ethan had deepened, and now he was seeing it in full force. The boys, once lost in a world they didn't understand, were no longer the victims of their circumstances. They were creating their own path. And Andrew, too, had found a new sense of purpose in this work. It was no longer just about fixing his own mistakes or seeking redemption for his past. It was about building something better, something that could last long after the exhibition was over. As he watched the boys work, a thought lingered in his mind. When had it all changed? When had he gone from someone who was simply trying to correct his wrongs to someone who was actively shaping a future with people who had once seemed so different from him? He hadn't always seen it, but now he did. They weren't just helping him, they were helping each other, building something that none of them could have done alone. "Hey, Andrew," Owen called, pulling him from his thoughts. He was standing near the table with the art supplies, a smile on his face as he motioned for him to come over. Andrew made his way over, his heart light. The boy was holding a stack of photographs in his hands, each one capturing a moment from their journey, a snapshot of the faces they had met, the places they had transformed, the connections they had built. It was a collection of memories, tangible proof of everything they had accomplished together. The boy's eyes sparkled with excitement. "You should see this," Owen said, handing him one of the photographs. It was a shot of a group of kids from the local school, all gathered around a mural they had painted together. The mural was a mosaic of colors and shapes, a reflection of the community's diverse people and stories. It was beautiful, chaotic, and full of life. It was their life. Andrew looked at the photo for a long moment, taking in the joy on the faces of the children, the pride in their eyes. He could almost hear their laughter. It was a simple moment, yet it meant everything. "Are we really doing this?" Andrew whispered, almost to himself. Owen nodded, his grin widening. Yeah, we really are. It was then that Andrew realized just how much had changed. This wasn't just a project. It wasn't just about giving back or finding redemption. It was about connection, about belonging, about showing people, especially themselves, that they could create something meaningful, something worth fighting for. As the evening wore on, the center began to fill with people, neighbors, friends, even a few local politicians, all gathered to witness what Andrew, Owen, and Ethan had worked so hard to build. There were no grand speeches, no over-the-top performances, just simple people coming together to celebrate a job well done. Andrew looked around the room, taking in the faces, the conversations, the smiles. It felt like home. The sound of children's voices caught his attention, and he turned to see a group of young kids standing near one of the artwork displays. Their eyes were wide with admiration, and one of the girls was holding up a small drawing she had made of Ethan and Owen. She smiled shyly at the boys, showing them her work. Ethan leaned down and smiled back. "You're really good at this," Ethan said, his voice soft but genuine. The girl beamed. Andrew felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched the exchange. It was a small moment, but it was everything. Ethan had learned not just to accept kindness, but to give it in return. He had learned to connect with others, to see them not as charity cases, but as equals. This wasn't about giving what they didn't have. It was about sharing what they did. Later, as the event came to a close and the last of the guests made their way out, Andrew stood by the door, watching as Owen and Ethan gathered their things. It had been a good night, one that would stay with him for a long time. The change in the boys was undeniable. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. And Andrew, too, had found his place, not just as a mentor or a guardian, but as part of something larger than himself. The cool night air greeted them as they stepped outside, and for the first time in a long while, Andrew felt at peace. The weight of the world had not been lifted from his shoulders, but something else had shifted. He wasn't trying to fix everything anymore. He was just living, learning, and growing together with the people who had become his family. "Told you we'd make it," Ethan said, looking up at him with a grin. Andrew chuckled. "I guess you did." He glanced over at Owen, who was quietly packing up the last of the supplies. When their eyes met, there was a quiet understanding between them. They didn't need words anymore to communicate. They had built something together, something real. "Tough road ahead," Andrew said softly, his voice carrying in the cool evening air. "But it's worth it." Owen nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll figure it out, together." Andrew took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the future and the past settle into a new place within him. He had come a long way from the man who had first crossed paths with these boys. And yet, as he looked at them, now truly looked at them, he realized that he was no longer the same man. They had all changed, in ways that were both small and monumental. They had found their way back to each other, back to something real, something lasting. Cliffhanger. Andrew paused as he looked down at the boys. They had given him more than just a new perspective. They had given him something he hadn't known. He needed hope. "I'm glad I found you guys," he said quietly. "I don't think I would have figured this out without you." But as they turned to walk down the street, a new challenge loomed ahead, one that none of them had expected. They had learned how to build something from nothing, but could they protect it? The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the community center, casting long shadows across the floor. The low murmur of conversation and the rustling of paper mixed with the soft hum of the air conditioning. It was another day of preparing for the next community event, a collaboration between Andrew, Owen, and Ethan. They had managed to gather a small group of local volunteers for the project, a mix of people who, like them, were trying to find something worth fighting for. But it wasn't just about the event anymore. It was about building something together, and that something was beginning to take root in a way none of them had expected. Andrew moved around the room, checking on the various displays and talking to the volunteers. He found himself immersed in the task, but his thoughts were elsewhere. There was a sense of calm in his heart, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He was no longer caught in the whirlwind of guilt and redemption. This was something different. This was something he had earned. As Andrew stood near the front of the room, reviewing the final arrangements for the event, he heard a small voice behind him. Bo. The word caught him off guard, and for a moment he stood still, frozen by the sound of it. Bo. It was the Vietnamese word for father. He turned slowly, his eyes landing on the small face of a child who had wandered into the room. The child's face lit up when she saw Andrew, and she smiled, looking at him with a certain familiarity. The word echoed in the quiet space, reverberating in Andrew's mind long after it was spoken. It wasn't just the word itself, but the way it made him feel that threw him off balance. It wasn't as if he hadn't thought about his role in Owen and Ethan's lives, but hearing that word, especially in such an innocent, unguarded moment, struck him in a way he hadn't prepared for. He realized then, with a sudden clarity, how much he had changed. He had become more than just a mentor to these kids. He had become a constant in their lives, someone who had stepped in when no one else would. And for that, they saw him as something more. But it wasn't easy. The weight of the realization pressed down on him. Could he be the father figure they needed? Could he fill that role when it had never even crossed his mind before? There was no manual for this, no blueprint to follow. But standing there, watching the child look at him with such simple trust, Andrew couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, he was already doing it. He was already becoming what they needed, whether he was ready for it or not. Andrew crouched down to the child's level, offering a soft smile. "Hey, kiddo." "I'm not your dad," he said gently, though his voice was full of warmth. The child didn't seem to care. She grinned and shook her head. "You're like my dad," she said, and then she ran off to join her friends, leaving Andrew standing there, his heart racing. The simplicity of the moment left him in a strange state of shock. He felt a mix of emotions, fear, uncertainty, but also something new, something he hadn't realized he was missing. Before he could collect his thoughts, Owen and Ethan appeared, walking toward him. They had seen the entire exchange, and though neither of them said anything, their eyes spoke volumes. Owen gave him a quick nod, as if to reassure him, while Ethan simply looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing the situation in his mind. Andrew stood up and turned to them, his face still unsure but his voice steady. "Did you hear that?" Owen shrugged but smiled, his expression not quite as tense as it had been in the past. "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice soft but firm. "But it's true, isn't it? You've been there for us. You're more than just a friend." Andrew's breath hitched, the gravity of the words sinking in. He hadn't thought about it like that before. He hadn't thought that he might actually be needed in a way that went beyond fixing problems or helping out when asked. He had become a part of their lives, as much as they had become a part of his. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Andrew confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt a knot in his chest, a mixture of anxiety and hope. Could he really do this? Could he be the kind of man they needed him to be? "You're already doing it," Owen said, the certainty in his voice almost startling. "You're doing fine." Andrew shook his head, the doubt still lingering. "It's not that easy." "Owen, I don't want to mess this up." "We won't let you," Ethan said, stepping closer. "We're in this together." Andrew looked between the two boys, seeing the resolve in their eyes. In that moment, he understood something deeper than he had before. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about getting everything right. It was about showing up, day after day, even when it felt like too much. It was about being there for each other when it counted. A silence fell over them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding. They didn't need to speak any more words. They had all said what needed to be said without realizing it. As the evening wore on, the event came to a close. People had trickled in and out, the art exhibition a success in its own quiet way. Andrew watched as the community lingered, talking and laughing, children running around excitedly. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like a part of something bigger than himself. When the last of the guests had left, Andrew stood by the door, watching Owen and Ethan say their goodbyes to the volunteers. They had done something truly meaningful, and it had nothing to do with the accolades or recognition. It had everything to do with the connection they had forged with each other and with the people around them. And that, Andrew realized, was more than he had ever expected from this journey. As he turned to leave, the child who had called him Beau earlier reappeared, tugging at his sleeve. She held out a small drawing, one that she had obviously worked on for a while. "Here," she said, smiling up at him. "For you." Andrew looked at the drawing, his heart swelling. It was simple, a crayon sketch of three people standing together, their arms linked, surrounded by bright colors. It was him, Owen, and Ethan. They were connected, a family in the making, a family built on trust and love. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep this forever." And as he walked out into the cool night, the drawing in his hand, he realized that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had already built something unbreakable, together, and that was enough. Cliffhanger. As he walked down the street, the weight of the future heavy on his shoulders, Andrew couldn't shake the thought that the real test was yet to come. The challenges ahead were big, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Andrew stood at the head of the long, polished conference table, his hands folded in front of him, staring down at the documents spread across the surface. The room was filled with an air of tension, each person in the room exchanging looks of disbelief. It was as if they couldn't fathom the decision he had made, the decision to invest his time, energy, and resources into something that they believed was not only a waste of his focus, but also a threat to the future of his career and the legacy of the company. At one end of the table, Simon Barker, the head of the board of directors, leaned forward, his glasses gleaming in the harsh overhead light. "Andrew," this he started, his voice thick with impatience. "This initiative, this project you're so focused on, it's starting to affect your reputation. The investors are not happy. They don't understand why you're spending so much time with these children." Andrew exhaled slowly. He'd heard this before, but it felt different this time. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Each word Simon spoke felt like a weight being piled onto his chest. The room was cold, the tension palpable, yet Andrew couldn't shake the warmth he felt when he thought about the boys, Owen and Ethan, and the work they were doing together. He had come a long way since he first met them, and no amount of corporate pressure was going to make him second-guess his decisions now. "I understand your concerns," Andrew said calmly, lifting his head slightly to meet Simon's gaze. "But this is more than just about my career or the company's profits. It's about something bigger, something I can't ignore anymore." A murmur ran through the room, but Andrew pressed on, his voice steady and strong. He had spent the past few weeks struggling with the weight of this very moment, but now, standing before the people who had always seen him as just a businessman, he knew what he had to do. "We've been building something here," he continued, his voice rising just enough to command attention, not just for the company, but for the community, for the kids who've never had a chance. Owen and Ethan are a part of that. They are the future of this place. And so am I. If that's a problem for anyone here, then perhaps we need to reconsider where we're headed. Another round of murmurs filled the air. Andrew could feel the eyes of the room on him. Some were skeptical, others angry, but none of them were willing to challenge him directly. The atmosphere was heavy, and it only thickened as he spoke again. "You don't understand," said Karen Lowell, one of the top investors, her voice sharp. "This isn't about charity. Andrew, you can't save the world and expect to keep everything else intact. You're jeopardizing your position, and that's not something anyone can afford." Andrew's stomach tightened at the words. They were right in a sense. He was risking everything for something that didn't have a clear financial return, something that didn't fit into the neatly organized world of corporate politics. But when he looked at Owen and Ethan, the thought of turning his back on them felt unbearable. The sacrifices he'd made, The time he'd spent in their world, it was all a part of something more important than any business deal he had ever signed. "I'm not trying to save anyone," Andrew said, his voice low but firm. "I'm simply trying to build something real, something meaningful. I've spent my life building walls, walls that kept people out, kept me from feeling this. This is my chance to tear them down, to do something that matters." There was a pause. Andrew could see the uncertainty flicker in some of their eyes, but it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold, hard resolve that had always been present in this room. Simon spoke again, his tone more calculated now. "We're talking about your future, Andrew, the company's future. You've spent years building this. Don't throw it all away over something like this." Andrew looked around the table, meeting each gaze for a brief moment, and then turned his attention to the window, his thoughts momentarily drifting outside the sterile boardroom. He thought of Owen and Ethan, their smiles, their determination, the way they had changed him, the way they had shown him that life could be more than just about numbers and balance sheets. They had given him a sense of purpose, something he had long forgotten. "I'm not throwing anything away," Andrew said, his voice steady now, more resolute than before. "I'm building something new." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the silence that followed was thick with tension. He could feel the room shift as the others processed his declaration. Some were confused, some were angry, but none were unmoved. Simon's lips curled into a tight smile, one that Andrew could sense held more than a little skepticism. "You do realize the gravity of this, don't you? If this project fails, it will be on your shoulders. The company, your career, everything will be at risk. And when it all crumbles, who's going to be left to pick up the pieces?" Andrew turned back to face him, the weight of Simon's words heavy on his chest. But the fire in his heart grew stronger. "I don't choose. I rebuild," Andrew said slowly, the words deliberate and final. "I don't need to tear down what I've built, but I can't go back to the way things were. If that means risking everything, then I'm ready for it." There was a brief moment of silence. No one spoke. The room, once filled with the hum of quiet conversation and occasional murmurs, was now filled with the deafening weight of Andrew's decision. He had made his stand, and the future of his career, and perhaps the future of his very self, was now tied to that choice. The air in the room seemed to freeze, and just as Andrew was about to speak again, the door to the boardroom opened suddenly, and a new voice entered the scene. "Is everything all right in here?" It was Gregory, his voice carrying an unexpected calmness that seemed to break the tension in the room. His eyes flicked to Andrew, then to the others, as though sensing the storm that had just passed. Andrew didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, and for a moment, he couldn't bring himself to say another word. Gregory's presence was a sharp reminder of the betrayal Andrew had only just begun to process. But Simon, seeing the shift in the atmosphere, was the first to respond. "We're just finishing up," he said, his voice clipped. Andrew stood there, his heart beating faster, knowing that everything had just changed. There would be no going back now. The choice he had made about Owen, about Ethan, about his future had been sealed, and there was no escaping the consequences. He wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but as he stood there, facing down the pressure, he knew one thing for certain. He had chosen his path, and now he would have to walk it. Cliffhanger. As the tension hung in the air, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The future of the company, the future of his relationships, and the future of his own sense of purpose. Everything was now in question. Andrew sat quietly at the conference table, the weight of the world pressing on his chest. The room was filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional shuffle of papers. He could hear the whispering behind him, the murmurs of disapproval. It was as though every eye in the room was on him, waiting for him to crack, to show that he was no different from the man they had once believed him to be. A man who lived for his career, who used his power and influence for his own benefit. But Andrew knew that he was no longer that person. The past few months had been a whirlwind of change. His work with Owen and Ethan, the community projects, the scholarships for the local children, the renovated cultural centers. It had all started with a single spark, a single belief that there was more to life than business deals and boardroom politics. And now, that spark had grown into a fire, one that was changing the very fabric of the community around him. But with that change came consequences. The media had caught wind of the stories. Whispers turned into headlines. And soon, every newspaper and news channel was talking about Andrew. The story was simple. Andrew, the successful businessman, had used his power to further his own personal interests, using community projects as a guise to boost his reputation. They painted him as a man who had sacrificed his integrity for the sake of image and influence. It hurt more than he cared to admit, but Andrew wasn't afraid. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also done things that mattered, things that had changed lives. Owen and Ethan had shown him that. And now, standing before the board of directors, the investors, and all the people who had once been in his corner, Andrew was ready to face the music. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The room fell silent as he walked to the front, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, judging, waiting for him to falter. But there would be no faltering today. He was done pretending to be something he wasn't. "I know what you've all been saying," Andrew began, his voice steady but firm. "The media has their version of the story, and so do you. You think I've used my influence for personal gain. You think I've manipulated this situation for my own benefit." He paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. The weight of the room's judgment pressed down on him, but he didn't let it show. He had nothing to hide anymore. "But you don't know the full story," Andrew continued, his voice rising slightly. "You don't know what it's like to be trapped by your own past, to live a life where every decision you make is calculated, where everything you do is driven by success and fear. I've spent my whole life building walls that kept people out, kept me from feeling. But Owen and Ethan, they tore those walls down. They made me realize that there is more to life than what I had been living, more to life than business deals and boardroom politics." The silence in the room deepened. Some of the people around the table shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this level of honesty. But Andrew wasn't done. "I didn't do this for the accolades," he continued, his voice calm but resolute. "I didn't do this for the recognition or the fame. I did this because I believe in something. I believe in these kids. I believe in this community. And I believe in the power of change. If you can't see that, then maybe I've been wrong about what this company really stands for." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room, but Andrew didn't back down. He wasn't finished yet. "I've made mistakes," he admitted. "I've used my power in ways I shouldn't have. But I've also done things I'm proud of, and I won't apologize for those things. Not anymore. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for your respect." As the words left his lips, Andrew felt a wave of calm wash over him. The tension in the room was palpable, but he could feel something shifting, a change, small but significant. He had finally said the truth, and now it was out in the open. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Simon Barker, the head of the board, cleared his throat. "And what do you expect from us, Andrew?" he asked, his voice thick with skepticism. "Do you expect us to just ignore the fact that you've been using this company's influence for your personal projects?" Andrew looked Simon squarely in the eye. "I don't expect you to ignore it. I expect you to see the bigger picture. The world is changing, Simon, and if we don't change with it, we'll be left behind." The room was silent again, but this time, there was no judgment in the air, no harsh glares, just a quiet, uncertain hum as the board members processed Andrew's words. But just as the tension was starting to dissipate, Andrew's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down, seeing a text from Owen. "When are you coming home? We need to talk." Andrew's heart sank. He had promised Owen that he would be there for him, no matter what. But now, with everything happening in the boardroom, he wasn't sure if he could be the man he had promised to be. The weight of his decisions, The pressure from all sides, it was overwhelming. The room around him seemed to fade into the background as he stared at the text. He had made his stand. He had done what he needed to do, but there was still one thing left to face: the future of his family, the future of the community he had come to love, and the future of his own heart. Andrew. Simon's voice broke through his thoughts, and he snapped back to the room, his heart still heavy with uncertainty. "I'm not finished," Andrew said, his voice suddenly firm, "but I'm done pretending to be something I'm not. I won't let the past define me anymore. I'm rebuilding my future, and if that means facing the consequences, then so be it." He turned and walked out of the room, his mind racing with thoughts of Owen, Ethan, and the new life he was building. As the door swung shut behind him, he knew there was no going back. The battle was far from over, but Andrew had taken the first step toward redemption. And then, as he walked down the hall toward the elevator, he received another message. This one was from Ethan. "We're waiting for you, Andrew. Don't let the world stop you." He smiled to himself, the weight lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore, and whatever came next, he would face it with them. Cliffhanger. As Andrew stepped into the elevator, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. What would the world think of him now? And would he ever be able to fully forgive himself for the choices he had made? The atmosphere in the community hall was charged with an energy that Andrew hadn't felt in years. The space, once a dilapidated warehouse, now gleamed with fresh paint, vibrant artwork, and the laughter of children. Owen and Ethan stood beside him, their faces alight with pride as they watched the fruits of their labor unfold before them. The exhibition was more than just an event. It was a testament to everything they had fought for. The neighborhood that had once seemed so distant, so disconnected from the world of power and influence, was now at the center of something beautiful. The walls, adorned with colorful murals created by the local artists, told the story of struggle, resilience, and hope. Students from the local school had painted their dreams on canvas, capturing the essence of their lives in a way that felt both personal and universal. Andrew had never seen such raw emotion displayed in the open, and as he stood there, his heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. Surrounded by parents, teachers, and community members, Andrew realized that this was the real reward, not the recognition, not the headlines, but the quiet, shared moments of gratitude from the people whose lives had been touched. There was a respect in their eyes, a recognition of the change that had come, not just in the neighborhood, but in Andrew himself. As the evening continued, Andrew found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The man he had once been, the businessman who had kept everyone at arm's length, who had used his power for personal gain, felt like a distant memory. The person he was now, standing in the middle of this room, surrounded by the people who had become his new family, was someone who had learned the true meaning of connection. He didn't need to have it all anymore. All he needed was to be a part of this world, a part of the lives of those he loved. A young girl approached him, her face bright with curiosity. "Mr. Blake," she asked hesitantly, "when will Mr. Ethan come back?" Andrew's heart tightened at the mention of Ethan's name. He hadn't realized how deeply the community had come to see the boys as their own. Owen and Ethan had become more than just two kids from the streets. They were symbols of hope, of change, of a better future. He turned around, scanning the crowd, and that's when he saw Ethan, standing at the back of the room. Ethan had grown so much, both in stature and in spirit. He was no longer the timid, uncertain boy Andrew had first met. He was strong, self-assured, with a smile that radiated warmth. The sight of him standing there, in the same space that had once been a place of despair, was a moment of triumph, not just for the community, but for Andrew as well. Andrew watched him for a moment longer, and a deep sense of peace washed over him. Ethan had found his place. And Andrew, in a way, had too. This wasn't just about building something tangible. It was about building something lasting, a bond that transcended bloodlines, a family born from shared purpose and mutual respect. As the evening wore on, the buzz of conversation softened, and a hush fell over the room. The principal of the school stepped forward, holding something small and delicate in her hands. She walked over to Andrew, a quiet smile on her face. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a small, intricately carved statue. It was a figure of a teacher, holding a book, with the words guidance, strength, love etched into the base. Andrew took it in his hands, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface. The weight of it, both physical and emotional, settled in his chest. But it wasn't just the statue that moved him. As he looked closer, he noticed something else, a small, folded letter resting beneath the sculpture. He gently picked it up, unfolding the paper to reveal the familiar handwriting of his late father. The words on the page were simple, yet profound. "Andrew, my son, I've made many mistakes in my life. I've hurt people, including you, but I see now the man you've become, and I am proud of you. Please know that I never intended to hold you back. You've always had the power to choose your own path, and I hope, wherever you are, you'll find peace. I'm sorry for everything. May you find happiness, not in the power you once craved, but in the love you've found." Tears welled in Andrew's eyes as he read the letter, his heart aching with a complex mixture of emotions. His father's apology, though too late, was the final piece of the puzzle he had been trying to put together for so long. It was a moment of forgiveness, not just from his father, but from himself as well. Andrew looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze across the room. The two boys had always been his anchor, but now it was clear that they had become something even more. They were his family, his future, and they had helped him see what really mattered. "Thank you," Andrew whispered to no one in particular, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan, sensing his presence, walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. He didn't need to say anything. The bond between them spoke volumes in that one quiet gesture. They didn't need to be the same. They didn't need to have the same past or the same future. All that mattered was that they were there, together, looking forward, side by side. As the night drew to a close, Andrew took a moment to step outside. The cool night air hit his face, and he closed his eyes, taking in the sounds of the world around him. The city was alive with possibility, and for the first time in years, Andrew felt that he, too, was alive, not just for himself, but for the people he had come to love, for the future he had chosen. He stood there for a moment, looking out into the distance, feeling the weight of everything that had come before him. And yet, in that moment, he realized something profound. He didn't need to fix everything. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be present. To show up for the people who mattered most. Happiness isn't in what we achieve, he thought, but in who we become along the way. As he turned to go back inside, he saw Owen and Ethan standing in the doorway, waiting for him. The future was uncertain, yes. But for the first time in his life, Andrew felt ready to face it, not alone, but with his family by his side. The rain had stopped, but the scent of it lingered in the air, soft and grounding. As Andrew looked out the window, his gaze drifting over the neighborhood that had become so much more than just a place to live, he realized that things had shifted. Not because he had changed the world, but because, for the first time, he had found peace in the smallest moments, the ones where people simply showed up for each other. And maybe that's what it's all about, he thought, not fixing everything, but being there. One step, one person, one quiet gesture at a time. After all, isn't that how we all begin to heal? As he turned to go inside, a single thought lingered, unspoken. How do you know when you've finally found where you belong?